It's something that rarely happens, but it's happening right now. Sources deep inside the Kremlin, men who could die for their words, are talking to the Financial Times. They all say the same thing. Putin's generals have sold him a plan that doesn't survive contact with reality. They tell him Ukraine is bled dry. They tell him the Donbas will fall by autumn. And they're hiding one number from him, a number the Institute for the Study of War just published. And that number shatters the whole story. To understand what's happening in Moscow right now, we have to roll the map back to a time when another ruler sat in another bunker, and in the final months of his war gave orders based on a map that no longer had anything to do with reality. If history teaches us anything, it teaches us this: dictatorships don't die suddenly. They die in a very specific order. First, they lose the war on the battlefield. Then they lose the ability to understand they're losing it. And only then, when the gap between map and ground has grown too wide, does the whole system come apart. In May of 2026, Russia is deep in Stage 2. The pictures aren't new. Stalin spent weeks in 1941 not hearing that Hitler was about to attack, because the men doing the reporting knew the truth was a one-way ticket to Siberia. Hitler himself, in the final months in the Führer bunker, was moving divisions that no longer existed on maps his own generals laid out for him, because nobody wanted to be the first to tell him it was over. It's a pattern that repeats itself in every dictatorship from Madrid to Pyongyang. Anyone who climbs to the top of a paranoid power learns what to say. What remains is the top alone, with its own map. More than 3 years since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. More than 12 years since the annexation of Crimea. Vladimir Putin sits today at a table where nobody contradicts him anymore. The men who once told him the truth are gone. Some fell out of windows, some burned in helicopters, some simply disappeared. What's left are men who learned fast. They learned what happens when you draw the Tsar a bad picture, and they learned what happens when you draw him the picture he wants to see. That's the stage, and on this stage something is unfolding that will decide the next months of the war. Picture a room, high ceilings, a heavy wooden door, maps on the walls. On one of those maps, the biggest, the most important eastern Ukraine is broken down into arrows and lines. The arrows point west. The lines push forward. They show that Russia is winning. Into this room, one by one, walks Putin's military leadership. They bring a plan, one that sounds like victory, and they bring a deadline. Autumn of 2026. But out there in the frozen trenches around Kostiantynivka, in the basements of Pokrovsk, in the observation posts of Ukrainian drone operators, every soldier knows the truth. The arrows on the map aren't moving the way they're supposed to. The lines twitch forward, then back. 6 months for a single city. And that's just the beginning of what the generals are hiding from their president. This is where the story we're telling today begins. It isn't a story about a battle. It's a story about the most dangerous thing a dictator can possess: certainty without a foundation. And when that certainty breaks, everything else breaks with it. Let's start with the story itself. On May 13, 2026, the Financial Times published a report wrapped in the kind of silence that only a genuinely important leak produces. The paper cited 2 source groups. First, several people inside the Kremlin whose names were not given for obvious reasons. Second, Ukrainian intelligence services that have been monitoring the Russian leadership for years. What both groups said was remarkably consistent. According to the Financial Times, Russia's most senior military officers, the generals who report directly to Putin, have presented their president with a clean plan in recent weeks. The Russian army, they said, could bring the entire Donbas under control by the autumn of this year. That means both oblasts, Donetsk and Luhansk, completely. They told Putin that Ukraine's front was on the verge of collapse. They told him Kiev had lost the manpower needed to hold the line. And Putin, according to the same sources, believes them. More than that, one source told the Financial Times that the Russian president has become increasingly obsessed with the Donbas and is refusing to accept a ceasefire along the current front line. That's an important point. We are not talking about some secret plan that might one day fall apart. We are talking about diplomatic reality right now. Putin is taking this narrative, this supposedly guaranteed conquest, and turning it into the condition of every negotiation. He's saying, in the language of diplomacy, why should I pay for a part of what I'll get for free in 5 months? So far, so clear. Now, the other side. On the same day, May 13th, the Institute for the Study of War in Washington published its own assessment. ISW isn't a Ukrainian propaganda shop. It's a think tank that analyzes open-source information, satellite imagery, geolocated video, Russian and Ukrainian military blogs, troop movements. What ISW said about the prospects for a Russian capture of the rest of Donetsk Oblast can be summed up in a single word: grim. Their arguments were concrete. First, the terrain. Ukraine has spent years building a layered defense system of bunkers, trenches, and dragon's teeth that forms a dense depth belt behind Kostiantynivka in front of Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. Second, the Ukrainian counter-effort. ISW documents active Ukrainian counterattacks and medium-range strikes against Russian rear areas, strikes that disrupt logistics and tie down Russian troops. And third, the number that explains everything. Russia began its serious assault on Kostiantynivka in October of 2025. By May of 2026, 6 months later, Russia had achieved no significant ground gains in that single city. 6 months, one city, zero meaningful breakthrough. That's not my assessment. That's the balance sheet the Institute for the Study of War published. Let's pause for a moment. The generals are promising the entire Donbas in 4 months. The reality shows in 6 months, they couldn't take a single mid-sized city. When you read those two sentences out loud back to back, you can hear a lie crumbling. But that isn't the only signal coming out of Moscow. On May 29th, ISW published a follow-up assessment that added 2 more pieces to the puzzle. First, the state polling agency VTCOM reported a drop in Putin's approval rating of roughly 1.9 points, down to 67.5%, measured between May 18th and 24th. ISW itself noted that the precise VTCOM number was probably not reliable, but the real story isn't the number. The real story is that a state polling agency is publicly admitting a decline at all. A second state agency, FOM, claimed the opposite in the same breath. That contradiction by itself is a story. And second, almost as an aside, in the same assessment, an accusation from the Sumy front. A spokesman for a Ukrainian brigade claimed that Russia was building itself a fictional reality of invented territorial gains and specifically denied the Russian claim of having taken the village of Zapsilia. That's the voice of a party to the conflict, so it has to be read carefully, but it fits the larger pattern. 4 points. A story from inside the Kremlin, a cold analysis from Washington, a state poll that wobbles, and a voice from the front saying they're inventing victories. 1 picture. Now to the question that really matters. How does a country with intelligence agencies, with satellites, with frontline reports come to believe it will conquer something it hasn't been able to conquer in 6 months? The answer isn't a mystery. It's mechanics. 5 levers that together produce the picture. First lever, incentive. In a dictatorship, the truth isn't rewarded. The truth is punished. Anyone who walks into Putin's Situation Room in the spring of 2026 and says the summer offensive is likely to break through about as well as last year's offensive, which is to say, not at all risks what Sergei Surovikin risked after the Wagner mutiny. Anyone who walks in with an optimistic map gets rewarded, year after year. This isn't a moral failure of individual men. This is selection pressure. The ones who arrive with pessimistic assessments get filtered out. The ones who arrive with promises of victory move up. After 4 years of war, the Russian General Staff system is a filtered apparatus. It contains almost nothing but men who know what Putin wants to hear. The others are gone. Second lever, the physics of the battlefield. Look at the map Putin apparently doesn't want to see. Russia already controls roughly 70% of Donetsk Oblast. What's left is roughly 30%, the western part where Ukraine's main fortified cities sit. Kramatorsk, Sloviansk, Pokrovsk. This is the so-called fortress belt, a defensive line Ukraine has been building since 2014. Bunkers, firing positions, tank ditches, minefields at a density rarely seen in modern wars. To take the rest of the Donbas by autumn, let's say, by the end of October, Russia would have to run in 5 months an operation it has spent 6 months failing at in Kostiantynivka. Geometrically, that isn't impossible. It's absurd. Third lever, the price tag. Western estimates that have been consistent for months point to Russian losses on a scale not seen in any war since the Second World War. Thousands of tons of ammunition per week. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers killed or wounded since the start of the war. These are Western estimates, so they come with uncertainty, but the trend is unmistakable. The Russian economy carries that, but it doesn't carry it for free. Key interest rates have been at historic highs since the autumn of 2024. Inflation is eating into household income. The National Wealth Fund, the reserve Russia has been drawing on to finance the war, is visibly shrinking. Every month of this war costs. And the fact that the generals are telling Putin victory is within 5 months is precisely what stops him from cutting a deal that would limit those costs. That's the truly dangerous consequence of this lie. It doesn't just have tactical effects, it has strategic ones. Fourth lever, the echo chamber. Putin isn't stupid. The opposite. He's a career intelligence officer trained in suspicion. But since 2022, he's been gradually cutting himself off from independent sources of information. Western media is banned. Telegram channels are controlled. The few voices that still push back internally get labeled inside the Kremlin as pessimists or defeatists. What remains are briefings from the same men who have a personal interest in those briefings sounding positive. ISW puts it this way in its report, and this matters because it isn't my interpretation. It's the Institute's own assessment. Recent Ukrainian successes are producing tactical, operational, and strategic effects that dismantle Putin's narrative of an allegedly collapsing front. Only Putin doesn't see those effects. He sees the map his generals bring him. And on that map, there is no dismantled narrative. There's one more point about the echo chamber that often gets missed. When Russian generals present situation assessments to the president, those assessments aren't based on the open-source data the Institute for the Study of War works with. They're based on reports from Russian front commanders' men who in turn have the same incentives as the generals above them. A commander who reports that his battalion is advancing gets rewarded. A commander who reports that it isn't gets replaced. A cascade forms. At every level of the system, the picture gets shifted a little further in favor of victory. By the time it reaches Putin's desk, it isn't a map anymore. It's a fantasy with coordinates. Then there's a subtler phenomenon, the statistics of the invented victory. If you compare the daily bulletins from the Russian Defense Ministry against the territorial maps maintained by ISW and other open-source analysts, a pattern shows up. Villages get reported as captured, even when satellite imagery still shows them under Ukrainian control. Only weeks, sometimes months later, do those bulletins get quietly corrected or just forgotten. The Ukrainian brigade spokesman in Sumy, talking about a fictional reality, is describing exactly that mechanism at the lowest level. That's a party to the conflict speaking yes, but the pattern she's describing has been documented in open-source data for months. Fifth lever, and this is where it gets personal. This is the spot where I'm placing my bet. Dictatorships don't die from defeat. They die from the gap between defeat and the perception of defeat. As long as Putin believes he is winning in 5 months, he will not make peace. As long as he doesn't make peace, the losses, human, economic, social, keep climbing. Eventually, they reach a point where the gap cannot be maintained anymore. Then, one of two things happens. Either an advisor finally dares to tell the truth and does not survive it in one sense or another, or reality catches up with the briefing in a form nobody can deny anymore. A front collapse, an economic crisis, a political break. Which of those two happens first will determine how this war ends. And the deadline the generals gave Putin, autumn of 2026, is exactly the moment when that gap becomes publicly measurable for the first time. Let's talk about the next few months. We have 3 scenarios, and I'll tell you at the end which one I think is most likely and what conditions would make me pull my bet back. Scenario 1. Autumn arrives. The Russian army has not as expected taken the rest of the Donbas. Maybe the front has crept closer to Pokrovsk. Maybe Kostiantynivka has partially fallen, but Kramatorsk and Sloviansk are still standing. Putin faces a moment where the gap between his map and reality becomes impossible to ignore. What does he do? Here's my read: nothing big. He doesn't publicly fire generals because that would mean admitting he'd been lied to. He doesn't announce that he failed. He does what dictators always do when their deadlines run out. He redefines victory. The entire Donbas by autumn suddenly becomes, we already control what matters. Or, the strategic objectives have been achieved. Negotiations get pushed back another 6 months. The war goes on. That is my main scenario. The probability that it plays out, I'd put higher than the other two combined. Why? Because the system doesn't allow any other option that doesn't damage the dictator himself. The lie has to survive because without it, no career survives. Losses on both sides keep climbing. Approval ratings in Moscow erode in small steps the way they already are if you give VTZM even partial credit. The briefings inside the Kremlin adjust to the next deadline. And Putin keeps talking like he has the control he doesn't have. Scenario 2. An internal break. An advisor, a security services chief, an influential oligarch, someone dares to tell Putin the truth or forces it on him. A serious internal conflict erupts. In the extreme case, a palace coup, a forced abdication, a transfer of power. Probability low. Russia's political system has been groomed for loyalty for years. The men who have the power also have the deepest personal entanglement in the war. Anyone who overthrows Putin risks facing the same tribunal as Putin himself. That is a powerful mechanism holding the system together. And it is exactly that mechanism that keeps the lie alive. Scenario 3. Ukraine forces the wake-up. A Ukrainian summer or early autumn offensive, possibly using the long-range strikes ISW, has been tracking punches through a Russian front sector or hits Russian logistics in a way that visibly changes the map. Visibly enough that even the briefings can't hide it anymore. Probability medium. Ukraine has shown over recent months that it is capable of those kinds of blows. But a real operational breakthrough requires more ammunition, manpower, Western support at a tempo that isn't always politically available. It's possible. It is not certain. But if I had to watch for one early signal, I'd watch the strikes against Russian oil refineries deep in the rear, a class of Operation ISW identifies as leverage on the Russian war economy. If those strikes increase in frequency and depth through the summer months, then Scenario 3 moves up. Watch those reports. They're often quieter than the headlines about frontline cities, but they are the clearest signal that Russia's war economy is wearing out faster than Russia's map. So that is my bet. Main Scenario 1. Putin redefines victory. The war goes on, the gap between map and reality keeps widening, until at some point it cracks the bunker wall. And now, the condition under which I pull my bet back. If before the end of summer 2026, Russian troops actually take a major city in the Donbas, Pokrovsk would be the example, then the collapse narrative isn't just a narrative anymore. Then the map in front of Putin suddenly has a real basis. Then the generals weren't lying. They were just a little optimistic on the timeline. And then the whole picture of this video changes. Watch Pokrovsk. If the city falls inside the next 4 months, then I was wrong. I don't think it will happen. But I'm saying it anyway, because the difference between analysis and propaganda is that analysis tells you where it can break. Let's stay with the map for one moment longer. The map in front of Putin shows a victory that, by the best available data, is impossible. The map in front of us, the real one, shows a war that keeps going because one man spent too long in a room where nobody contradicted him anymore. Both maps exist at the same time, and over the next few months they are going to drift apart. If I'm right, we'll be able to tell. Watch for signs of a redefinition of victory coming out of Moscow, most likely in September or October. Watch for new camouflage language. Strategic objectives achieved. Protection of the population secured. When you hear those phrases, you know what they translate to. They translate to, the lie has collapsed and work has now begun on dressing it up. If this video explains something that lives behind the headlines, share it with someone who wants to read the reality underneath the story. And subscribe so you don't miss the next crack. The question to end on isn't whether Putin's generals lied to him. They did. The question is, what happens in the moment when reality gets louder than the briefing? We'll be there.